Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions, and today's opinions will be about The Last Continent by Terry Pratchett. So Terry Pratchett is one of my favorite authors, likely always will be. I have never read a bad Terry Pratchett novel, but this one just didn't work for me as well as the others did, though I think that might have not been the book's fault. Okay, so The Last Continent is the story of how Discworld's equivalent of Australia got messed up and fixed by the wizards of the Unseen University. Rincewind has washed up on the shores of XXXX, which is Australia, and is just trying to survive long enough to get to the coast where he can hopefully get a ship home. Meanwhile, the librarian at the university is sick. None of the wizards can figure out how to cure him because they don't know his name, and he won't tell them because he's an orangutan, which makes it impossible for them to do any magical cures on him. There is only one person they are pretty sure who does know the librarian's name: Rincewind. So 5 of the wizards run off in search of him and end up stranded even further afield than the mysterious Last Continent. So, as implied, this wasn't my favorite of the Discworld books that I've read, but I'm not sure it's the book's fault. I was oddly distractible while I was reading this book, and part of that might have just been my mood. These things happen. You're not always going to be in a reading mood. But part of it may have just been that the book did not quite click with me the way they usually do. Discworld books are satire, they are full of jokes, and a lot of the world building is built around those jokes. In Pratchett books, a whole lot of the jokes aren't one-off lines that you can read on by if you don't get them. They are often intrinsic to the way that the logic of the world works, which means that sometimes you do sort of gotta get the joke and references to understand what is actually happening. And one of the things I've always really been impressed with Terry Pratchett is that he has managed to consistently pinpoint what is pretty damn universal. And center his world building around that. Like, his jokes and references tend to be things that at least I feel like most everybody gets. But he also includes these little specific details that just, if you happen to know more about the theme of the book, make things extra funny. So like, if the book focuses on the post office, there will be ridiculous Pony Express and stamp collecting built into the structure of the story. And there will also be little jokes that you can just scan on by about mail sorting for those who happen to know in-depth knowledge about the postal service. And if the theme is Australia, we get lots of Mad Max, Vegemite, and Drop Bears, as well as a lot of slang that I'm pretty sure we weren't actually supposed to understand. And I don't know if maybe I just don't know enough about Australia, or if, for once, Terry Pratchett didn't do as good of a job of pinpointing which would be tropes that everybody knew and focusing on those. But there were just an unusual number of jokes in this book that I didn't get. And like, I could tell that these were moments that were meant to be referencing something, and if I had known the logic of the reference, it would have been a lot more understandable for the scene in general. And so I kept just rereading those passages over and over again. This was the first Terry Pratchett book I have ever had to stop and Google references to figure out what the hell was going on. And ultimately, that's actually not a huge problem. Not every joke in every comedy has to hit for every reader for it to still be a quality book. Especially because the comedy is nowhere near the only strength in Terry Pratchett's books. The wonderful thing about Discworld books is that there's often this deeper meaning to the casual jokes, and this book is no different. This book is playing around with some rather complex concepts of evolution and the human delusion that we are the meaning of the universe and the peak of evolution, with how space and time interact, and the nature of being a hero. And I love the way it all feels silly, like silly play, until you stop to actually think about it later. And you end up going down these complex roads in your own mind, trying to like straighten out whether or not stepping on an ant in the past actually could erase your future self. Like, is that even possible? And the book is playing with some really interesting time travel paradoxes in a way that I think is both really creative and interesting. The wizards are changing things in the past, which causes the things to have always been different in the current. And ultimately, I just liked the way that Terry Pratchett was playing with this. It was fun. It was an interesting take. And I really liked watching the two sides of the story slowly work their way towards each other. It becomes pretty clear pretty early on that the wizards from the Unseen University are likely the cause of the lack of rain, but it's not until the scene where the disaster is literally unfolding in front of your eyes that it becomes clear how they caused this and what must be done to fix it. But one problem I did have with the fact that I didn't get into this one as much and had to reread so many of the jokes was it made me hyper aware of the fact that the structure of this book is odd. And I honestly think that's actually probably pretty common for Terry Pratchett books, and I just don't tend to notice it. Many of the Discworld books really are just a series of events only connected by the fact that they are happening to the same character or right around the same time, and then they come together to form this ridiculous climax. They are often like those episodes of sitcoms that start with this utterly ridiculous image of disparate shit happening all at once, and someone says, "I bet you wonder how I got here," and then you jump back to the beginning to find out how all these different weird elements came together. Except in the Terry Pratchett books, there is none of that first tableau. You just get all that random shit slowly building up as little bits get added in, and they make sense in their own story enough that when they all come together to create this insanely ridiculous scene, you just sort of go, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. And because you are enjoying each scene as it goes through, and you are getting to know the characters and the world, and if you've ever read Terry Pratchett before, you trust that this is all going to come together in the end, you sort of accept that it's going somewhere and you just enjoy the ride. But I think it was because I wasn't really enjoying the individual scenes as much, I wasn't finding them as funny, that this one felt really episodic to me. The things the university wizards are doing have pretty much nothing to do with what Rincewind is doing until pretty damn late in the book. And yeah, they do go down to the professor of cruel and unusual geography's office, hoping that he will help them find Rincewind on XXXX. But once they wander through his window onto a desert island, they barely think about Rincewind for 200 pages. And I mean, that is sort of part of the nature of this kind of story, where you're getting two different, basically, storylines coming together to create one storyline. But there's also the fact that the university wizards are defined by their inability to do anything quickly and without arguing, which can be hilarious, can be fun, can be really enjoyable to watch, but it does not lead to a really coherent narrative. I was talking to a friend about how hard it is to, hold the details of Pratchett's storylines in your head sometimes, and I realized that though I had finished this book literally last night, I didn't actually remember each step on the wizard's path from the sick librarian to the wall paintings. And yeah, I do usually lose those details from Discworld books eventually, but it usually takes me a week or two, not a night. And their half of the narrative is the one that is significantly more cohesive. Rincewind is literally just running from one vaguely Australian interaction to the next, almost none of which actually have anything to do with the overarching story until we make it to the brewery. At least with the university wizards, there were no steps on the journey that you could cut and end up with the exact same conclusion, but with Rincewind's part of the story, we could have gone straight from the introduction of Scrappy to the sheep, and only had a couple of jokes and character goodbye parade at the end that would need to change. And episodic does not mean bad. I often hate it when series decide to stop being episodic and get an overarching plot. And I will admit that's mainly because they tend to also feel the need to get a lot heavier at that exact same moment. But I think the episodic nature bothered me more with this book, because there are also no secondary characters in Rincewind's half of the book that carry over from one vignette to the next, except for Scrappy, who is less of a character and more of a plot contrivance. All he exists to do is introduce Rincewind to the fact that he has a quest and force him to stay on the right path. Nicolette was with him from the last vignette through the climax, which makes her feel more important, but by page count, she's in almost as little of the book as Mad. And because all these characters are met so briefly, they make very little impact on Rincewind's emotional arc. And emotional arcs can be motivated by meeting random series of characters, but we tend to see them displayed in the way two characters interact, changing over time. So, like, we see emotional arcs in the fact that, like, for example, two sisters go from hating each other because they are polar opposites to them understanding each other and so not letting their differences spark fights. And the only way you can really accomplish the same thing, show that emotional arc with a storyline that does not have characters that continue through to the end, is to have continuing interactions with the same kind of characters. So, like, you can achieve the same kind of overarching emotional arc by having a character that in the beginning is really mean to her sister because her sister complains all the damn time, and then, you know, at the end of the series, whatever, she meets another character who complains all the time and is really nice to her because she's learned to understand where that complaining is coming from, or whatnot. But the problem here is that Rincewind's arc is primarily about learning not to run away, but to actually try to deal with problems. But most of the time he spends running in this book is actually taking him towards his final confrontation. And the only characters that really directly impact this particular arc are Scrappy and Neilette, at the very beginning and the very end. Everything else in between, Mad, Dongo, the Short Horse, the Drop Bears, the Beer Soup, the Gala, the Diva Dessert, everything on this trip to the city is just him running some more, being better or worse at running depending on the situation. So yeah, it felt a little bit like there wasn't so much a plot as just a series of events for a huge portion of this book. Which I still insist is not inherently a problem. As long as you are enjoying those events and they are at least vaguely working towards one coherent theme, they can still make a good book. But one other note I want to talk about with the characters here. This is not a female-heavy book. The only women are Mrs. Whitlow and Neilette. And Mrs. Whitlow exists pretty much just to facilitate the joke that wizards don't know how to interact with women. She's a fun background element, and like many of Pratchett's women, she is noticeably more competent than any of the men around her. But that's about it. And then there's Neilette, who actually does seem to have some interesting depth, but she's only in the book for about 20 pages. We've also got a couple of drag queens who are absolutely great, but I don't even think there are any background guards in this book that are female. And I've said in the past, I don't necessarily need there to be a lot of women, as long as the women in the book are treated with respect and humanity. But I would just like a couple more girls, like one or two. I also was a bit worried when I picked up this book because, let's face it, Terry Pratchett was a white man from Great Britain, and they don't have a long history of being good about representation of indigenous peoples. And I think Pratchett was aware of that. Like, there are a couple of moments that he makes jokes in this book of characters thinking of themselves as not racist. And at least one of those moments, it is being made by someone who is being flagrantly racist at that moment. And it's presented in a way that it is very clear that they are shitty people, they are being shitty, the book is not supporting these viewpoints. But mostly Pratchett just skirted the issue entirely by not having many Aboriginal characters whatsoever. There's a reference to them or more than one. There are several references to them existing, and there is definitely nods to them in the world building of the continent, but that's about it. Which I think is the better choice than just blatantly getting shit wrong, but be aware that this isn't the best book when it comes to diverse representation. And I've managed to do it again. I've made a review where I talk almost nonstop about all the things that I don't like about, when overall, I did like the book. This one's not going to go on my list of favorites of the year, nor really favorites of Discworld, but I had fun reading it. I laughed out loud. I found quotes that were really profound and silly and beautiful and biting all at once. I think that by the end of the book, Rincewind's character had actually grown enough that I no longer was just laughing at him. And, like, Rincewind in the early books really is a bit of a one-trick pony. Like, all he is bad at magic and a coward. But by the end of this book, I really felt more of his humanity, his empathy, his desire to be good and be liked for who he is. I weirdly felt more emotional stakes in Ponder, around the middle of the book. Like, his arc is... it sort of happens completely on its own, and it concludes literally in the middle of the book. Like, I mentioned this book has a weird structure, but I liked the time we spent with him, and developing him into more rounder of a character. Pratchett occasionally gives us utterly beautiful moments of characters who would otherwise be a sort of just running joke and nothing else. And the Bursar gets one of those moments in this book. And it's this beautiful moment where he's watching creation, and it's so beautiful and lovely, and you're finding out about his soul. And I was actively angry when the others showed up to fuck it up, even though that was as inevitable as the ticking of a clock. So yeah, this is a lovely book. It's just a lot easier to talk about your problems with a book than the things that work. When a book is working really well, you aren't thinking about how it works. You don't stop to ask yourself, why do I like this? You aren't thinking about reading. You're just enjoying it. And so, yeah, this was a book I generally liked. It just wasn't one of my favorites, and I feel like it doesn't quite live up to the rest of Discworld. And it turns out, I don't know as much about Australian tropes as I thought I did.